So the moment of self-revelation was closely connected with realizing the fallibility of your parents.
Yes, one could say so.
Now, what about...
But I realized that I had fear of my mother, but not during the day. There she was quite known to me and predictable, but in the night I had fear of my mother.
And can you remember why? Can you remember what that
I
fear...
have not the slightest idea why.
Carl Jung believed that the science and rationalism of modern man had robbed him of his ability to reach for symbolic truths, but not to take everything at face value. The actual events of stories can be less important than what they represent. It should come as no surprise, then, that the Persona games approach storytelling in much the same way. They are, after all, predominantly based on Jung's model of the psyche, as we've seen time and time again in this video series. However, there are those who don't quite grasp this. They cling to their rationalism and try to find some sense of continuity and logic between these games, as if it really tells us much of anything. Granted, the games often indulge in this a little with small nods to past events, like this single reference to the Nanjo group in Persona 3. While that original trilogy of games did maintain a continuous story throughout, the modern era would more or less do away with this. From here on, continuity would become selective. The rules established in Persona 3 don't necessarily mesh with the ones established in Persona 5, and vice versa. But that's fine. We've now left the world of logic and realism and have entered the realm of symbols. They present themselves to us and reveal universal truths about the unconscious. We may strive to understand them, or be ruled by them, like an invisible hand of fate. We'll try to avoid the latter and see the bigger picture. This image may only have one meaning to you. It's the moon, the celestial body that orbits the Earth. But by the end of this video, it'll have many other associations, all of which reveal some grander truth about the story it appears in. Make no mistake, the purpose of this analysis series was never meant to be a substitute for actually playing the games. I'm disappointed by anyone that is of this mindset. No, the true purpose is to make you think symbolically, as Jung himself once espoused, and equip you with the necessary tools to get the most out of these beautifully crafted video games. You're not going to get that from any other channel or video series. So allow me to extend a hand and say, once more, welcome to the ultimate Persona Compendium. It's been several years since the original Persona trilogy came to a close, and we're now in the PS2 era, a time that could easily be considered the golden age of Atlus games. By this point, the old guard had established the Megaten franchise and continued to refine it artistically. But it was also a transitionary period for the developer, a bridge between the old and the new. Some of those old faces would depart the company altogether, while others would take more of a back seat to focus on other titles. The next mainline Persona entry would therefore be helmed by mostly a new team. Those that did return did so with much larger roles. Shigenori Soejima, for example, would become the main character designer and overall art director, taking up the mantle of Kazuma Kaneko. Katsura Hashino would become the new series director. He had never worked on Persona games previously, but he was the designer of Shin Megami Tensei If, which could be considered a semi-prototype of the Persona series in a lot of ways. We also have Shoji Meguro becoming the main composer after collaborating on Persona 1's soundtrack. but before actually ruining Persona 1's soundtrack.
I corrected it.
It's typically these three men that are held up as the main creative force behind Persona 3 and the modern Persona games in general, in much the same way as Kaneko, Okada and Satomi were for their games. Although, it must be said, the latter's photo shoots were significantly cooler. There's something very funny about how these game designers present themselves as rock stars. The fact that some of them would be characters in the games themselves only added to this mystique. It creates a nice personal connection between the player and the creators. This also exists in Persona 3 to a lesser extent. The appearance of Tanaka is based on the new scenario writer, Yuichiro Tanaka, who we don't really know much about. He doesn't appear in too many interviews, and when he does, he doesn't go in depth into his writing. Perhaps he prefers to let his work speak for itself. Regardless, logic dictates that he was every bit as important to the creative process as Tadashi Satomi was, but we really don't know for sure. For the purposes of this analysis then, I'll be mainly focusing on the creative input of Katsura Hashino, since he's spoken more on the game than anyone else. I don't wish to understate Tanaka's work though, so feel free to attribute some of the grander details I'm going to be discussing to him. Believe me, there's a lot to cover. Many of the series' fundamental ideas return from the first three games, so I'll only be giving them a cursory explanation here. You can click on the series playlist and watch from the beginning if you really want to be brought up to speed, but it really isn't necessary to enjoy or understand this analysis. Like the game itself, it'll be a fresh start for new fans. I'm mainly going to be focusing on just the original Persona 3 here without any of the added fluff that Atlus would later tack on. There'll be no The Answer and Persona 3 portable material here, at least not in the first couple parts. They'll get their own analysis videos at a later date. I have, however, made one exception with the Aeon social link that was added to the game's Fez re-release. It fits so nicely into the character analysis section that there really wasn't a good reason to omit it. Now, with all that said and done, let's delve into Persona 3. Persona 3 begins with an important reminder, one that will be ever relevant to the game's themes. Time never waits. It delivers all equally to the same end. You, who wish to safeguard the future, however limited it may be, you will be given 1 year. Go forth without falter, with your heart as your guide. The full weight of these words will become clear within time, but for now they act as an introduction to Persona 3's new central mechanic. From the very beginning, Persona was conceived as a more relatable take on the Shin Megami Tensei formula. Instead of a post-apocalyptic wasteland, the setting would be a regular high school, with a fairly average cast of high school students peacefully going about their lives. However, in the older games, this relatable status quo would be shattered early on, and became warped beyond recognition in the latter half of the story. While there wasn't anything wrong with this approach, it didn't do too much to separate it from the mainline Shin Megami Tensei games, nor did it take full advantage of its premise from a gameplay perspective. It was still just an old-school dungeon crawler with a different skin. Persona 3 gave us a completely new take on this idea, one that doubles down on the relatability factor. The plot would introduce the otherworldly dungeons from the get-go, but frame it within the normal day-to-day routine of a high school student. The protagonist of this game is initiated into the specialized extracurricular execution squad, which as its name suggests has him performing duties outside of his ordinary curriculum, the specifics of which we'll get into a little later with the plot synopsis. But for now, the important part is that he'll have to balance his time effectively. It's a sort of double life resembling that of a superhero. In the daytime, he'll have to study for exams and maintain relationships with his peers, while in the evening, he must fight monsters known as shadows as a Persona user. Being the player character, his name is left up to you to decide. I'll mainly be referring to him as protagonist, main character, or simply hero, while the gameplay footage on screen will show the name that the later canon would adopt. I thought I should clarify this because some people take the names in these games way too seriously. Anyway, Persona 3's protagonist differs from others in that a much greater emphasis was put on his connection to the player. It goes back to that relatability factor I mentioned. Instead of taking control of a character with a pre-established relationship with the rest of the cast, we're put in the shoes of a transfer student who is just as new to this setting as we are. Or so it would seem at first. He's also the only character you ever have direct control over. You do have party members, but they're controlled by the AI and make their own decisions based on the strategy you give them. This might sound the same as the older games, but the key difference is that the strategy you give them is merely a framework. It gives them a basic suggestion on how to act, but the action itself is left up to that party member, and it can result in some terrible or even sometimes fatal tactical blunders that a player would never make. This is perhaps the most controversial gameplay mechanic in the entire series, and it doesn't take long to find someone with a strong opinion against it. There are many rants about how Mitsuru is always casting Marin-Karin or Mind Charge, how Yukari uses a single healing spell instead of a full party one, etc. I myself have many grievances with how Koromaru never seems to do anything remotely useful. He has fire, but rarely uses it on enemies that are weak against it, even when you show him exactly what to do. It's certainly a valid criticism, and one that almost every video on this game will go on at length about. But I think many tend to direct their ire in the wrong place. The problem with the battle system isn't that you can't control your party members, it's that the AI makes bad decisions. One could have existed without the other. And yet most come to the conclusion that the game should have had full party control right from the get-go. Even Atlus themselves seems to have reached this conclusion eventually, since it was a feature they added to the PSP version. It's important to understand why the original Persona 3 was made without full party control in the first place though. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate design and stylistic choice to set Persona 3 apart from other JRPGs on the market at the time. As we've discussed, a big part of it was to make us feel closer and more connected to the protagonist. But it goes deeper than that. Another radical departure this game made was to allow only one character who can switch personas at all, whereas the original allowed everyone to do it. The main character can hold multiple personas within himself and change to them as the situation demands, but your party members are limited to the ones they have. On the surface, this appears to conflict with the idea the entire series was based on. The persona was conceived as the medium between the external world and a person's psyche, one that would change to deal with different environments. The word originally referred to the mask worn by actors to indicate the role they played, and this is the function it serves for an individual in modern society. We're actors playing a part, and that part is whatever is convenient in any given moment. We might define this false self as the persona, that general idea of ourselves which we have built up from experiencing our effect upon the world around us and its effect upon us. The persona is, in Schopenhauer's words, how one appears to oneself and the world, but not what one is. Fundamentally, the persona is nothing real. It is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. This would mean that individuality is only an illusion, and that no individual is truly authentic. But this isn't really the case. A persona carries with it parts of the unconscious. This allows a sense of continuity between the many personas, which gives the impression of a cohesive personality. The persona is thus neither authentic nor inauthentic. It's simply one of the infinite possibilities within the psyche. This idea is portrayed faithfully with the protagonist, but not the party members. What sense does it make for someone to only have the one persona for every situation they find themselves in? It seems to be a contradiction of the concept, not to mention the continuity from the older games. Perhaps you could come up with some theory, like how only those who have entered the Velvet Room can change personas, something that can only be done by the protagonist in this game. That would be missing the point though. Remember what I said? We're now in the realm of symbols, so it's important to think about it in those terms. This is another example of Persona 3 reinterpreting ideas to convey its own unique take on the series. In real life, with enough self-scrutiny, we may be aware of the many personas we ourselves don, but we're completely in the dark when it comes to other people. This is because they only ever present to us the one persona, the one they have deemed the most acceptable for the environment.
It is completely reasonable to think that, in terms of psychological persona, the other characters had various ones for when they were shopping, hanging out with friends, and doing a multitude of other things that the hero has absolutely nothing to do with. We just couldn't bring all that into the mix because we needed some way to create a definitive separation between the hero and the other characters, from the player's point of view.
This interpretation of the concept, if anything, is more faithful to Jung than even the older games. The intention is clear. Instead of being in the shoes of a main character with omnipotent knowledge of his friends' hearts and minds, we're now as we are in real life, isolated from our fellow man. It may not make much logical sense for the other characters to only have one persona, but it makes symbolic sense from the perspective of the hero, and that's the important part. Before we move on with the rest of the analysis, it's worth giving a brief overview of the game's story. If you haven't played this game for a while, this will act as a sort of refresher on the most relevant details. It should also aid those who haven't played the game at all, also known as the people who didn't listen to me at the front of this video. But that's okay. This will be the last time I pick on you, I promise. This section will skim over the character nuances for the most part. But worry not, because that will be the focus of a later part. Feel free to skip to the next section if you like. We begin the journey with our unassuming hero arriving at his new place of residence, a dormitory situated at Tatsumi Port Island in Iwatodai City. He's initially met by the mysterious apparition of a young boy at the reception desk, who asks him to sign a contract agreeing to take responsibility for his own actions. He soon meets the real residents of the dorm, a senior named Mitsuru Kirijo and fellow classmate Yukari Takiba, who introduces him to his new high school the following day.
We're here! Welcome to Gekkokan High School! Hope you like it!
However, all is not what it appears in this seemingly peaceful island city. In truth, there's a hidden hour between one day and the next when reality is warped into a waking nightmare. This is known as the Dark Hour. For most, it passes instantaneously, but there are those who find themselves trapped there and preyed upon by shadowy monsters. These people become part of the Lost, which describes those who have been afflicted by a condition called apathy syndrome. Essentially, they become hollow shells of their former selves. There is another type of individual that experiences the Dark Hour every evening though, and these are those with the potential to manifest a persona and resist the shadows. The protagonist is one such individual, as are everyone gathered at the dorm. Mitsuru, with the help of her wealthy family, had formed a secret task force to deal with the Dark Hour and the shadows that dwell there. In particular, they must go up against the powerful ones that roam around under every full moon, for reasons that are yet unclear. In hopes of discovering the truth, they explore a mysterious giant tower that takes the place of the school during the Dark Hour, Tartarus. Initially, their numbers are quite small, but more members are enlisted as these full moon shadows are defeated. Like Mitsuru, Akihiko Sanada is a senior, and has been there since the very beginning. Junpei Iori joins right after the protagonist. Fuki Yamagishi becomes a member after the team rescues her from Tartarus. Igus is an anti-shadow robot built by the Kirijo group. who joins up after developing an obsession with the protagonist during their trip to Yakushima Island. Lastly, we have the youngest of the group, Kanamada, and the canine persona user Koromaru. They're under the impression that once all the full moon shadows are gone, the dark hour will finally come to an end. This is what the school's chairman, Shuji Akutsuki, has been directing them to do, and it seems to be confirmed when they discover the truth of the dark hour at Yakushima Island, a truth that Mitsuru had been struggling to tell them. 10 years ago, the Kirijo group had dabbled in things they were not supposed to. They were experimenting with the shadows and discovered a terrifying prophecy that put the entire world at risk. As a result, the lead scientist, Eiichiro Takiba, Yukari's father, attempted to put a stop to the research, but in doing so caused an explosion that brought the Dark Hour and Tartarus into existence and dispersed the shadows. With his final words, he urges those who find his confession tape to seek out the shadows and vanquish them. Afterwards, the site of the experiment was rebuilt into Gekkoukan High School by the Kirijo group. They would use it to further investigate Tartarus using those who had the potential to venture inside, the persona users. Natural persona users were a rare breed, however, so they went about creating artificial ones. Very few of them survived, but those that did escaped and formed the criminal group Strega, who wished to stop Seas from accomplishing their mission. They try, but are repeatedly defeated by the team as they take down the full moon shadows one by one. After destroying the last one of the Moonlight Bridge, they're confident that the Dark Hour will soon come to an end, and they can return to their mundane lives as high school students. They even celebrate the following evening, but it isn't meant to be. The Dark Hour comes like usual, and Akutsuki reveals the reason why.
The 12 shadows were parts of a whole. They were destined to be reunited. And that was accomplished in no small part, thanks to your efforts. Soon, Death, the Almighty, shall arise and bring forth the fall.
What the team were fighting for was not the eradication of the Dark Hour, but the fulfillment of the prophecy discovered by those scientists 10 years ago. The head of the Kirijo group at the time, Koetsu Kirijo, was a nihilistic man who had become captivated by the idea of the fall, an apocalyptic event that would bring about the end of humanity. Akutsuki was one of the many scientists who shared his dream, so he's been working behind the scenes to make it happen ever since. This includes the creation of the artificial persona users and even Seas themselves. He even went as far as doctoring Eiichiro Takiba's final words to manipulate his daughter. Somehow. All along, they've been unwittingly working towards the death of everyone and everything. With the truth revealed, Akutsuki now attempts to kill Seas using Agus, but she resists her programming and instead chooses to save her new friends. With this shocking revelation, the team are at a loss on what to do next. Their entire purpose has been rendered meaningless. Nevertheless, they decide to keep exploring Tartarus to prepare themselves for what's to come. Meanwhile, a new transfer student named Ryoji Mochizuki joins the school and is met with open hostility from Igus. Even as he becomes friends with everyone in class, including the protagonist, she still views him as a dangerous threat. This is because, as it turns out, he's not the unassuming new kid he and everyone else thought he was. He's actually the appriser of death, the one who acts as a harbinger of the fall and signals the arrival of the godlike being Nyx. Igus had instinctively sensed that he was the enemy of humanity that she'd fought and sealed away 10 years ago. It was a battle that took place on the Moonlight Bridge and took the lives of the hero's parents. With no alternative, Igus used the hero's body to seal away the harbinger of the fall and prevent the arrival of Nyx. This is why he appears to the protagonist every now and then in the form of a young boy named Pharos. The two form a strange sort of friendship over the course of the game. It's this bond that gave him something that he didn't have before. humanity and individuality. When he had finally matured, he sprang forth from the protagonist as Ryoji and lived as a normal teenager for a time. However, he's soon awakened to his true purpose, and is powerless to do anything about it. His time spent with the hero has made him sympathetic to humanity though, so he's willing to give them a choice to consider. If they kill him, their memories of the Dark Hour will vanish, and with it, their knowledge of the Fall. They can do nothing to stop the arrival of death, but they can choose to spend their final days in ignorance of their impending doom. Ryoji pleads with them to take his offer instead of throwing away their lives in an unwinnable battle, but they refuse. Determined to live, they decide to face Nyx on the day of its arrival. On January 31st of the following year, they head to the top of Tartarus for the final battle that will decide the fate of humanity.
I saw a TV show once where they were discussing how the topic of death has no place in our elementary education system. They visited a classroom of 4th graders and asked, who thinks someone can come back to life after dying? Half of the class raised their hands. The seriousness and finality of death seemed like such a foreign concept to them. The closer you get to high school, the greater the chance that someone you know will die unexpectedly. Still, most students only think of death as an unfortunate incident or an accident, something that is a rare and random thing. In fact, I'm pretty sure that even people in their 30s haven't given any serious thought to things like life and death.
Memento Mori, a Latin phrase meaning, remember that you are mortal, remember that you will die. These words can be found in the opening movie before the game has even begun. It's more than a little bit of flavor text though, it's our key to interpreting the entire game's symbolism from top to bottom. The inevitability of death is one of the most recurrent themes at the forefront of Persona 3. It's weaved into nearly every facet of its design in a way rarely achieved in a video game. It's very much in the same vein as those older games with how the Jungian archetypes are baked into the mechanics themselves. This is still present in the 3rd game, of course, it's still right there in the title, but now it's treated more as a foundation for the story to explore something new and bold. Anyone who has ever come across this game, even in passing, can probably tell you about its most famous bit of symbolism, even if its actual meaning is often lost on them. It is, without a doubt, the most provocative bit of imagery in its repertoire. Persona 3 gives a flashy new way for the characters to summon their personas in battle. In previous games, they just summoned them. But here they must be forced out with an evoker, a tool that purposefully mimics the appearance of a gun. It's introduced in the opening cutscene, with Yukari holding it to her head and struggling to pull the trigger. This moment serves a couple narrative functions. It's having a bit of fun with the shocking imagery to misdirect the player, but more importantly, it conveys something that is never explicitly stated. It's telling us that shooting yourself with an evoker is every bit as scary as if it were a real gun. Every time the characters summon their personas, they have to look down the barrel of a gun and be reminded of their mortality. And that, in essence, is what a persona user is for the purposes of this story. It's someone who chooses to acknowledge death instead of turning a blind eye, like those people Hashino was referring to earlier. Normal people don't know of the Dark Hour's existence. They're transmogrified into coffins and are completely unaware of anything that happens there. But the Persona users have to live through it and remember.
It's like trading away your innocence. In exchange for power, you can no longer look away from the things you don't want to see.
This is because, like the Evokers, the Dark Hour is another reminder of our mortality, a memento mori. It's something the characters must endure. It's something they choose to endure, and it's something we must endure. Death is something ever-present and inescapable. Not only are the characters forced to face this every evening, but so are we. We're told right from the beginning that we will only be given 1 year. Even before the game begins, we've been given a time limit. We're being told up front that our time on this earth is finite and we're not to forget. The clock inside of Tartarus is ticking and the calendar is marking down the days. We also find ourselves relentlessly pursued by a powerful shadow known as the Reaper if we wait around too long in Tartarus. Even if you do manage to defeat it, it will come back an infinite number of times. Any victory over death is but a temporary one. These are all fairly obvious ways in which Persona 3 reminds us of death, but as I hinted at in the opening, it also uses a much more Jungian means of conveying this central motif. It uses primordial images that have an instinctual, unconscious meaning to us, even if it isn't often clear on the surface. Before we get to Jung though, it's important to introduce a theory that was proposed by his former mentor, Sigmund Freud. He was a proponent of the pleasure principle, the theory that we're driven to pursue pleasure and avoid pain above all else. However, in the essay Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he revised this theory to account for the many contradictions he observed. After all, if the main goal of life is to seek out pleasure, why do people dwell on the past and become mired in neuroses? He speculated that life is driven by two diametrically opposing set of instincts. One is known as Eros, the tendencies for life to self-preserve, build relationships with others, and propagate the species, while the other does quite the contrary. These instincts seek the shortest path to the grave. They lead individuals to self-destructive behaviors, such as risk-taking and apathy. These are the death drives, and they would later be named after Eros' opposite, Thanatos. What purpose does it serve living beings to seek out their own destruction? Why does Thanatos exist? Freud described it as an urge inherent in organic life to restore an earlier state of things. But what does this mean exactly? This is addressed, albeit indirectly, in the writings of Carl Jung, where a similar idea frequently emerges. The key difference, however, is that whereas Freud's Thanatos has its aim a literal corporeal death, the death with which Jung is concerned is not simply a biological event, but a psychological state or reality which has meaning in its own right. It's this symbolic death where our interests lie, and it's explored at length in Jung's Symbols of Transformation, which I believe Persona 3 draws heavily from. Here, he relates the unusual fantasies of a woman named Miss Miller and tries to make psychological sense of them. One of these is a hypnagogic poem about a moth flying towards the sun. The moth is Miss Miller herself, and what she longs for is the radiance of the divine, the archetypal sun hero of myth, who has been worshipped as a god in many cultures since time immemorial. Young, comely, with glowing locks and fiery crown, who, forever unattainable to mortal man, revolves around the earth, causing night to follow day, and winter summer, and death life, and who rises again in rejuvenated splendor to give light to new generations. For him, the dreamer longs with her very soul. For him, the soul moth burns her wings. Here we see that the moth to the flame spells inevitable disaster, because what it longs for is in conflict with itself. Its passion leads it to something greater than itself, but in doing so is scorched by the sun's rays. Passion raises a man not only above himself, but also above the bounds of his mortality and earthliness, and by the very act of raising him, it destroys him. This rising above himself is expressed mythologically in the building of the heaven-high Tower of Babel that brought confusion to mankind, and in the revolt of Lucifer. Even if a longing for the highest is legitimate in itself, the sinful presumption and inevitable corruption lie in the very fact that it goes beyond the fixed human boundaries. The longing of the moth is not made pure by reaching for the stars, nor does it cease to be a moth on account of such noble aspirations. Pursuing passions can either bring wholeness or destruction, and it's for this reason that we're wary about trying to live up to the Sun Hero. But to deny these passions is to stifle the very will to live itself, which robs us of our purpose. The moth may burn in the sun's rays, but death is an opportunity for renewal, and this itself is the archetypal journey of the Sun Hero, one that we must all tread. The sun rises over the horizon to its zenith and shines brilliantly in the sky. It symbolizes life, psychic energy, and impulse. In the language of tarot, it's heavily associated with happiness and satisfaction, but the sun's time in the heavens is finite. It must soon descend to the ocean and be consumed by an all-encompassing darkness. And what takes its place in the sky is an even more powerful symbol, one that you'll immediately recognize as having an important presence in Persona 3's symbology. I am, of course, talking about the moon. The moon ushers in the dark hour, the ordeal our hero must overcome if his light is to shine the following day. The sun is an abstract symbol, but it finds human form in the many sun heroes of myth. Therefore, his antagonist must also take a human shape. This is something that's directly mentioned in the game's opening, with this French text. It translates to, "Death has been personified as an anthropomorphic figure or a fictitious character since the beginning of humanity." Death dons many guises in Persona 3, but all point back to one source: death itself, Nyx. This is a figure that requires further explanation, since an antagonist named Nyx already appeared in one of the previous games. I did say that focusing on story continuity kind of misses the point, but this is an exception to the rule since it tells us quite a lot. Nyx has very little explanation in the game itself. Everything you need to know is told through dialogue, and everything else is hinted at through clever symbolism, which much of this analysis is dedicated to exploring. However, the lore itself was concretely explained in a piece of canonical supplementary material called the Persona 3 Club Book. It gives us something of a creation myth for the entire Persona series, or at least the newer Hashino-directed ones. The information here is framed as a Q&A between various Persona 3 characters, but it mainly has Aigus asking questions and Akutsuki answering them. In prehistoric times, the Earth was struck by a colossal living being of alien origin, the original form of Nyx. The impact caused a large chunk of debris to break off into orbit and become the moon. The physical body of Nyx was enclosed in the moon, whilst her psyche remained on Earth and made contact with the primitive life forms there. The psyche of Nyx existed in a sort of wave form that threatened to wipe out all living beings, so a rapid evolution took place to resist it and seal it away. This gave birth to man's greatest weapon, the collective unconscious. These are the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious, the archaic heritage of humanity, the legacy left behind by all differentiation and development and bestowed upon all men like sunlight and air. But in loving this inheritance, they love that which is common to all. They turn back to the mother of humanity, to the psyche, which was before consciousness existed, and in this way they make contact with the source and regain something of that mysterious and irresistible power which comes from the feeling of being part of the whole. Life is naturally driven to fight against its own destruction. The life drives, also known as the Eros, suppressed the deadly waves of Nyx and allowed humanity to develop into complex sapient life. But the psyche of Nyx still lays dormant in the collective unconscious, waiting for its revival. This is where the shadows come from. They're the tiny fragments of Nyx that were separated in the impact. Their main goal is to fuse together into larger shadows so that they may eventually unite into one and free the psyche from the collective unconscious, where it can finally return to its original body on the moon. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the darker and undesired aspects of the personality that have been repressed. That is to say, they've been pushed into the furthest recesses of the unconscious. This archetype makes its presence known to us in the form of symbols, and are sometimes even personified as dark, primitive creatures driven purely by instinct. This is the form they take in Persona 3, and they're encountered as the mortal enemies of the Persona users. This makes sense since they're the rejected parts of ourselves that go unassimilated into the Persona. The Dark Hour may represent death, but it's also a stand-in for the unconscious itself. It's a realm of symbols beyond the purview of those without strong self-awareness, which is why only those who have embarked on a journey of self-discovery may set foot there and do battle with its contents. It's simply another allegory for Jung's individuation process, the act of finding one's true self and fully realizing their potential. An innate urge of life is to produce an individual as complete as possible. Those without self-scrutiny don't have the necessary tools to deal with the unconscious, and are therefore vulnerable to the influence of the shadows.
No! I don't want to hear this!
They're drawn into the Dark Hour by the shadows and have a part of themselves consumed, which turns them into empty shells inflicted with apathy syndrome. The part they take should come as no surprise, since it's what they need to facilitate the return of Nyx. They take their shadows. The shadows may be antagonistic agents of Nyx, but they're also a vital aspect of the human unconscious as well. In this regard, they fulfill the same purpose as their Jungian equivalents. The shadows are our repressed, nihilistic longing for death. It calls to us from the bottom of our souls with words of comfort, promising salvation. It tells us to give in to our temptations and embrace the abyss. Should we choose to accept it and give up on life, we're left with nothing. No desire, no aspirations, no feeling, only apathy. This is spiritual and potentially even corporeal death.
What I fear most isn't death. What I fear most is attachment. Once I become attached to something, I fear that I will lose it. That's why we only live for the moment.
It isn't the shadows that are calling for death, it's humanity itself. Once again, we find that amusing contradiction at the centre of the human heart. The battle between Eros and Thanatos. We find ourselves wishing to live and to die. This delicate tightrope balance has its purpose though, as Persona 3 shows us. Without plunging into the darkest depths, the Sun Hero can never rise again in full splendour and reach his destined potential. It's only when we have something to lose that we fear death, and it's only when we fear death that we're truly alive.
I'm afraid.
We must behold death, for it teaches us how to live. This is one of the many archetypal tales passed down through the collective unconscious of humanity. They aid our heroes on their journey to triumph over death in the form of the personas. When man becomes God, his importance and power are enormously increased. That seems to have been its main purpose, to strengthen the individual against his all-too-human weakness and insecurity in personal life. This is why this game in particular draws a distinction between the personas and the enemies, the shadows. All of them come from the collective unconscious, but only one of them serves our darker impulses. With one exception. The being that was created through the unification of the shadows by the Kirijo group.
They said I was death, the 13th arcana that was never meant to be. And I wasn't in this world for long before parts of my body escaped me, leaving me incomplete, as I was when I met you.
Through the protagonist, Ryoji gains the form of Thanatos, which originates from the personification of death in Greek mythology, a sort of grim reaper that carried people to the underworld, including the dungeon for the wicked, Tartarus. This being stays dormant within the protagonist for much of the game, and, like the Freudian drive of the same name, is pushing him towards death.
Go on.
To be more specific, it's pushing him towards its mother in mythology, and arguably the mother of all creation in Persona 3's universe, Nyx. Always he imagines his worst enemy in front of him, yet he carries the enemy within himself, a deadly longing for the abyss, a longing to drown in his own source, to be sucked down to the realm of the mothers. I did say earlier that I would explain the difference between the Nyx here and the one that already appeared in the first game. The one that was inhabiting the Snow Queen mask was merely an archetype of the collective unconscious, one that was meant to teach humanity how to combat the true primordial being that spurred creation. This is why the Nyx of Persona 3 has an extraterrestrial origin removed from any real-world mythology. She, or it, operates outside of everything we know, for Nyx represents the darkest depths of the night, the fear of the unknown. Let's back up a bit and return to the archetypal journey of the Sun Hero, who must eventually brave the darkness of nightfall. When the sun descends below the horizon, he finds himself consumed by an all-encompassing, endless sea. And what does the sea represent? Well, this one should be quite obvious to Persona fans, since it's mentioned in every single game.
Thou art I, and I am thou. From the sea of thy soul I cometh.
The sea, and water in general, points back to the collective unconscious as a maternal symbol of humanity. It is the life-giver, the protector, and the nourisher, just like a mother to her newly born baby. It is an absolute authority figure, which is why it manifests as all-encompassing symbols such as the ocean, cities, darkness, and even the moon. It also takes on a human guise as the many maternal goddesses seen throughout mythology. This is the Great Mother archetype in its purest form, as the birth-giver of human intuition and creativity. However, the duality inherent to the archetypes dictates that every positive force must also have a negative, a shadow self if you will. The antithesis of the Great Mother is the Terrible Mother, which is symbolically synonymous with death. This mother then is not only the mother of all abominations, but the receptacle of all that is wicked and unclean. The birds are soul images, by which are meant the souls of the damned and evil spirits. Thus, the mother becomes the underworld, the city of the damned. The underworld in Persona 3 is the Dark Hour, specifically Tartarus, which makes it symbolic of the terrible mother, death, and the unconscious all rolled into one. This makes it appropriate as the central gathering place of the shadows, and the main dungeon that the player explores for much of the game. The tower facilitates the arrival of Nyx, and its height represents humanity's collective desire for death. Its phallic appearance reaches out to the moon, which according to Jung represents the uterus. This makes the moon a very feminine symbol indeed, something that we previously learned in the Persona 2 analysis with Maya Amano. It's worth noting that the sun is a masculine symbol. So what we have here is the son trying to make his way back into the mother's body. For whoever sunders himself from the mother longs to get back to the mother. This longing can easily turn into a consuming passion which threatens all that has been won. The mother then appears on the one hand as the supreme goal, and on the other as the most frightful danger. The terrible mother. Needless to say, this requires further explanation, but I'm afraid I'll have to leave it for a later section of this video. For now, the important part is that humanity, represented by the Sun Hero and embodied by the protagonist, strives to return to his origin, the mother. This is a necessary step on his journey if he is ever to reach his destination.
(7月13日午前0時影時間始まる) Persona 3 Atlas.
No one can escape time. It delivers us all to the same end. You can't plug your ears and cover your eyes. And so it begins.
The journey of the protagonist is our journey, shaped by our decisions. This is the meaning of the contract that Pharos has assigned at the beginning of the game. In signing it, we're choosing to face death and see the journey to its conclusion. But what is that journey, exactly? It's all revealed in a deck of tarot cards. Or as Nyx would say, the Arcana is the means by which all is revealed. The tarot cards tell a story in numerical order, representing the spiritual growth and transformation of an individual as he embarks on a journey of self-discovery. The P3 hero finds himself in the role of this individual, as he holds the power of the Fool, the first card in the Major Arcana, bearing the number 0. The illustration on this card depicts a foolish wanderer. His innocence and naivety of the world suggests unlimited possibilities. As he moves through the Major Arcana, he encounters archetypal figures representing the different stages of life. He must incorporate these experiences into himself if he is ever to realise his full potential. These appear as the social links, the bonds with other people the hero must forge to strengthen his personas. Each one of these is a learning experience, a chance for the Fool to catch a glimpse of the many universal truths passed down by the collective unconscious. Like the personas themselves, these archetypes are the weapons the hero must arm himself with to combat the trials that await him. But as we discussed earlier, there's always a duality to the archetypes, and this also holds true for the tarot cards as well.
Be careful, this Hierophant is quite powerful!
The shadows also bear the Arcana, making them necessary obstacles on the Fool's journey. The RPG genre is uniquely suited for this kind of symbolism, since every defeated enemy gives the characters experience points to level up. Each new full moon shadow is stronger than the last, requiring the hero to get progressively stronger to survive. Each new experience is an opportunity for growth and to strengthen one's heart. The Arcana of the Shadows stands in opposition to that of the social links. One represents the card in its positive, upright position, and the other in its reversed, negative position. The game only requires that the hero defeats the latter, since most of the social links are entirely optional. I'll be giving a full analysis of each of them in a later video, so for the time being, we'll only be focusing on the more story-relevant full moon shadows. It's also worth mentioning that Persona 3 has its own tarot deck. This is heavily based on the Rider deck though, so we'll be using both for reference when analysing each arcana. First, the Fool faces the Magician, his entry into the world of the occult and mysticism. There's nothing too much to say about this one. It shows up and gets instantly obliterated by Thanatos. Next, the party comes across the High Priestess as it hijacks a train. The card depicts a woman with divine knowledge sitting between two pillars, one white and one black. This is symbolic of the duality in all things. The Persona 3 version of the card simplifies this illustration quite a bit, but the same yin and yang motif is still present. The priestess asks the Fool if he has the intuition to tell the light from the dark, the real from the fake. Next, we have the first double boss fight, featuring the two regal arcana, the Emperor and the Empress. Much of what I've said, and will continue to say about the Terrible Mother, is relevant to the Empress. The Queen of Life, in its reversed position, becomes the Queen of Death, the Destroyer. It's from this figure that we come to understand the meaning of life and death. The Emperor is the masculine equivalent, representing the Great Father in its upright position and the wrathful abuse of his authority in the reversed. After that, we come to the masculine counterpart to the High Priestess, the Hierophant. Upright, it points to conformity to traditional wisdom and teachings. particularly in regards to Orthodox religion, as the Pope-like figure alludes to. Reversed, this card can take on a myriad of different meanings, but in the context of this game, it seems to point to the hypocrisy and corruption of the pious leader. He has succumbed to the deadly sins of gluttony and lust, represented respectively by his obesity and throne held up by sexualized women's legs. Not to mention, this figure is encountered in the most inappropriate of places, a seedy love hotel. This brings us to the Lover's Arcana, a card that depicts the prospect of harmonious love between man and woman. This is a perfect union between the opposites. In the Rider deck, it also alludes to the fall of man through Adam and Eve, which warns of succumbing to temptations and losing connection to the divine. While the Hierophant is about following the order of society, the Lover's is about personal choice and responsibility. The importance of this choice is emphasized by the gulf or divide between the two figures. Reversed, the harmony is disturbed, and the union begins to show its cracks. It becomes about the lack of choice, which is what happens when the hero and Yukari are almost forced to give in to their temptations. The Lover's shadow is a goopy, melting heart, symbolizing love built on unsolid foundations. Next, Cease heads to the disused bomb shelter underneath Iwatodai to fight the next pair of Arcana, the Chariot and Justice, both of which join together to form a World War II era battle tank. The Chariot card illustrates an armoured conqueror standing on a chariot pulled by two sphinxes, one white and the other black, just like the High Priestess. The conqueror is able to make the two opposing sphinxes move in the same direction, representing his triumph over mind and spirit. When reversed, this control falls into disarray, and the conqueror becomes a conqueror in name only. His victory becomes defeat, which is why he's found not on the battlefield, but inside of a dingy old bomb shelter. Nevertheless, he holds on to his tyrannic justice and wields it as his main weapon, which is why it's the tank's cannon. Only when both the Conqueror and his justice are defeated is this battle won. The next month, the team fights a hermit at Club Escapade in Polonia Mall. It takes up residence there and connects itself to the city's electricity grid to use as a source of power. The Hermit card stands for introspection, and is illustrated with the lamp of Hermes Trismegistus, representing higher knowledge. Reversed, it takes on the meaning of becoming too withdrawn from the world in pursuit of inner knowledge. In the Shadow's case, this refers to how it focuses solely on draining energy for itself at the expense of others. Next, we have another dual boss fight, this time against Fortune and Strength. Strength is illustrated as a woman with flowers who has tamed a ferocious lion. The lion represents the wild, uncontrolled passions of the unconscious, and in taming it, the woman has achieved unity and strength within the self. Interestingly, Fortune, which mainly represents fate, seems to have taken on the role of the lion in this pairing. Reverse Strength implies that the raw passions of the lion are running rampant and are no longer under her control. Indeed, in this boss fight you must defeat Strength before Fortune becomes vulnerable. Now we get to the final full moon shadow, the Hanged Man, which hovers menacingly over the Moonlight Bridge, an omen of what's to come. The card depicts an entranced man hanging upside down on gallows. It's from this necessary sacrifice that he gains new insight and a different perspective on the world. And yet, in this position, he's stuck and is unable to take action, which can lead to spiritual stagnation. This is represented in the boss fight with how the Hanged Man must be forcibly removed from his position. The sun is behind the Hanged Man's head and is almost at its lowest point. It approaches the darkness of night, where the Queen of Creation awaits the final duel. What follows is some extremely striking imagery and symbolism. From the moon descends the Nyx avatar, the harbinger of the fall, and the fusion of Ryoji and Nyx. Standing defiantly before it are the members of Seas. determined to live and see tomorrow. It is the final challenge of the Sun Hero if he is ever to rise again the next morning. This is a very long and arduous fight that has many phases, all of which are represented by different arcana. It starts with a mirror being held up to the protagonist with the Fool. This is in reference to how Ryoji and the hero were once one and the same. From here, Nyx will go through the previously fought arcana before arriving at its 13th and final form.
The moment man devoured the food of knowledge, he sealed his fate. Entrusting his future to the cards, man clings to a dim hope. Yet the arcana is the means by which all is revealed. Beyond the beaten path lies the absolute end. It matters not who you are. Death awaits you.
It would appear that the Fool's journey comes to an end at the hands of the terrible mother, Death, which, as Nyx just said, is the fate of all humans after the biblical fall of man. But this isn't the whole truth. The Death Arcana is, at first glance, a terrifying omen of the end, and yet its place in the middle of the tarot deck seems to suggest otherwise. It actually tells of a spiritual death, rather than a corporeal one. It's a necessary process that brings with it an opportunity for renewal, just as the sun will always rise once more after sinking into darkness. Ascent and descent are actually two sides of the same coin. The Fool may descend into the unconscious to face himself, but he does so by ascending to a new state of being. His ascent signifies a renewal of the light and hence a rebirth of consciousness from the darkness, i.e. from regression to the unconscious. The protagonist climbing the tower to meet death and the rising elevator of the Velvet Room are both symbolic of this. All living things rise like the sun from water and sink into it again at evening. Born of springs, rivers, lakes and seas, man at death comes to the waters of the Styx, and there embarks on the night sea journey. Those black waters of death are the water of life. For death, with its cold embrace, is the maternal womb, just as the sea devours the sun but brings it forth again. Life knows no death. The terrible mother is the reason for the Sun Hero's deeds. He does everything to return to nothing, to the comfort of the mother's womb, so that he may be born anew. Ironically, he seeks death so that he may live once more. Of course, the son entering into his own mother would be a form of incest, which is why the symbol appears as a terrifying creature representing death. It's a taboo man must never break, lest he regress to his animalistic desires and become truly lost. Regardless, the hero must return to the mother so that he may break away from her and reclaim his unconscious contents. To sum things up for simplicity's sake, this journey is merely an allegory for Jung's individuation process, as many things are. The sun represents the conscious, and the mother the unconscious, which is the origin of all things. The sun delves into the unconscious to discover his true self and rise once more as a unified whole, a new person. This image is undoubtedly a primordial one, and there was profound justification for it becoming a symbolical expression of human fate. In the morning of life, the son tears himself loose from the mother, from the domestic hearth, to rise through battle to his destined heights. His life is a constant struggle against extinction, a violent yet fleeting deliverance from ever-lurking night. This death is no external enemy, it is his own inner longing for the stillness and profound peace of all-knowing non-existence, for all-seeing sleep in the ocean of coming to be and passing away. Even in his highest strivings for harmony and balance, for the profundities of philosophy and the raptures of the artist, he seeks death, immobility, satiety, rest. If he tarries too long in this abode of rest and peace, he is overcome by apathy, and the poison of the serpent paralyzes him for all time. If he is to live, he must fight and sacrifice his longing for the past in order to rise to his own heights. If the hero does not face himself, doesn't face his longing for death. He can never find rebirth through the individuation process and will inevitably come to spiritual stagnation. He must slay the beast known as the Terrible Mother and separate himself from her sweet embrace of death. This is an archetypal story as old as time, and in the modern context, this can be understood as a coming-of-age tale, of growing up and becoming your own independent person. Indeed, this is the exact type of story that Persona 3 is. It is, after all, primarily about the trials and tribulations of juveniles as they come to understand themselves and their place in the world. The natural course of life demands that the young person should sacrifice his childhood and his childish dependence on the physical parents, lest he remain caught body and soul in the bonds of unconscious incest. This imagery of sacrifice is a recurring one in this tale as well. This is the final piece of symbolism to decode before we get to the story's ultimate conclusion. The Persona series is no stranger to Christ allusions at this point. It was a big focus during my Persona 2 analysis, and it makes a return here. Like Maya Amano before him, the Persona 3 hero finds himself symbolically in place of Christ. The significance of this cannot be ignored, for it harkens back to the most important theme in the Persona series, the idea of striving for the self through individuation. In the distant past, an individual's worth was measured by his role within the family, and then later his role as a citizen. But this started to change after the 1st century with the rise of Christianity. Christ offered an alternative to a world that saw people not as individuals but as members of a group. Because only by using their free will to submit themselves to Christ, becoming one with His Holy Spirit, can they find salvation. This salvation was not offered to them as a representative of their family or government, but as an individual. First, Jesus crucified, then Jesus resurrected. Previously in antiquity, it was the patriarchal family that had been the agency of immortality. Now, through the story of Jesus, individual moral agency was raised up as providing a unique window into the nature of things, into the experience of grace rather than necessity, a glimpse of something transcending death. The individual replaced the family as the focus of immortality. As contradictory as it sounds, by offering themselves fully to the Lord, they've been granted everlasting freedom. They have regained that which was lost after the fall of man. Thus, individuality, the foundations of individuation, came into being, and man could achieve rebirth through faith. This is represented by the practice of baptism through water, which, as we've established, is symbolic of the mother's womb. In Christianity, for example, baptism represents a rebirth, as we have already seen. Man is not merely born in the commonplace sense, but is born again in a mysterious manner, and so partakes of divinity. Anyone who is reborn in this way becomes a hero, a semi-divine being. Thus, Christ's redemptive death on the cross was understood as a baptism, that is to say, as rebirth through the second mother, symbolized by the tree of death. Jung explains earlier the maternal symbolism behind the cross. In this world of images, the cross is a tree of life and at the same time a tree of death, a coffin. Just as the myths tell us that human beings were descended from trees, so there were burial customs in which people were buried in hollow tree trunks, whence the German Totenbaum, tree of death for coffin, which is still in use today. The Christ archetype offers up his life on the cross to subjugate his instincts and become one with the mother. He emerges as a transcendent figure associated with the sun, just like our sun hero archetype. Therefore, the Christ archetype is symbolic of the Jungian individuation process, the act of reaching the self and becoming a unified whole. Christ, as a hero and God-man, signifies psychologically the self, That is, he represents the projection of this most important and most central of archetypes. The archetype of the self has, functionally, the significance of a ruler of the inner world, i.e., of the collective unconscious. This should shed light on Persona 3's use of Christ and crucifixion for its symbolism. Let's go through them, shall we? Akutsuki intends to kill C's after they unified the shadows during November. He does this by putting them on crosses to sacrifice to the terrible mother, Nyx. Because the Dark Hour is so prominent in this scene, it must represent the negative aspect of the Christ crucifixion imago. It becomes the Tree of Death instead of the Tree of Life, which would stand for spiritual stagnation and a literal corporeal death, as opposed to a rebirth. The same can be said about Takaya, the leader of Strega, who strongly resembles famous depictions of Christ. He's a charismatic leader who preaches salvation, yet the salvation he speaks of is only to give in to nihilistic longings for death. He claims to speak the truth, yet only deals in short-sighted deceptions, like a false prophet. He stands in opposition to the protagonist as an antichrist figure. He's a death drive incarnate. It's fitting then that his persona is another child of Nyx from Greek mythology, Hypnos, the god of sleep. He's lulling his followers into a state of apathetic sleep, where they're susceptible to the death drive. Chidori, in particular, ends up becoming a victim of this. Instead of life, he strives for death. Instead of enlightenment, he teaches ignorance and apathy. Conformity instead of individuality. He's a mirror, a dark reflection of what the fool could become if he simply wallows in spiritual stagnation. He is the shadow of the Christ archetype, the dark half of the human totality, which is to say, he is the shadow of the self. He's a type of regressive figure that Jung was talking about in this quote from earlier. Both he and Jin act as the final obstacles before the party can face Nyx on January 31st. They die here, but they already died long ago, as prisoners of their own unconscious yearning for death. Finally, we have the protagonist, who is the most important expression of the Christ archetype in the entire game. His initial persona is Orpheus, the figure of Greek myth who descended into the underworld to save his wife, Eurydice. He used his mastery of the lyre to charm the ferryman Charon into carrying him across the river Styx, where he would plead with the god of the underworld, Hades, into letting her go. Hades agreed, on one condition. Orpheus is not to look back at his wife on their return from the underworld. He does so, but makes the mistake of looking back when he thought they were both clear of Hades' domain. Eurydice sadly wasn't, and she vanishes, lost forever to the abyss. Using our knowledge of Jungian symbolism, parts of this story take on a whole new light. The underworld is, of course, the unconscious, and Orpheus being able to navigate its depths through his skill shows us that he has a good grasp of himself. This makes him the perfect figure to represent the hero as someone who can explore Tartarus, and even challenge death itself. But what of Eurydice? She could be symbolic of many different things, but in our interpretation, she would be another part of Orpheus himself, possibly his anima. By turning back before the two are unified, turning his back on individuation, he loses a part of himself to the unconscious. This would make it a cautionary tale about the hero leaving his journey unfinished. Something that can actually happen if the player chooses to kill Ryoji instead of letting him live. Killing death in this context is essentially turning your back and choosing to ignore it. The correct path would therefore be letting it live and incorporating it into the ego, which is what the members of C's do by never forgetting it and facing it time and time again. But this is just the first necessary step on the individuation process. Death still appears as a terrifying figure rather than a hopeful symbol of rebirth. Thus death is a fundamentally ambivalent image. the implications of which depend on whether it is approached from the reality of the ego or from that of the self. For the former, death is indeed a fearful piece of brutality, but from the perspective of the self, death appears as a joyful event, a mysterium canutius through which the soul achieves wholeness. It seems in the good ending, the hero takes a tragedy of Orpheus to heart, as he's able to fuse him with Thanatos to create the perfect union of the opposites. This is Messiah, the ultimate persona of the Judgment Arcana and of the hero himself. He takes on the appearance of both Orpheus and Thanatos combined, and resembles a Christ-like figure on a cross. Messiah is not Christ himself though, merely the archetype. The sacrificial death of the ego in service of reaching the wholeness of the self. This is man's greatest endeavour, his telos. This finally brings us to the end of the game, where the hero's story would find a very similar resolution. After defeating the final form of the Nyx avatar, the party finds that all of their effort was for naught. The body of Nyx descends from the moon to reunite with its psyche and bring about the end of all life on Earth.
Why resist that which is inevitable? You'll only suffer.
All seems lost, but the protagonist recalls the unbreakable bonds of his social links. Each one taught him something new and important on his journey, and in turn he did the same. He left them with proof that he existed. Each interaction became his power and strengthened his resolve to cling to life and see his journey to its completion, which is where he now finds himself. He has arrived at the World Arcana, the end of the Fool's journey. It represents the end and the beginning of a new cycle. The card is illustrated with a woman in the centre of 4 figures that correspond to the 4 evangelists, something we looked at quite thoroughly back in the Innocent Sin video. This is a reoccurring arrangement that Jung called the Quaternity, and typically the centre is occupied by the sun and the image of Christ. This represents Christ as being at the centre of all things, and since Christ is symbolic of the self, it means that the Fool has integrated the opposites and become a unified whole. This is the ultimate symbol of accomplishment, and with it, the hero may now do the impossible and conquer even death itself. He ascends to the moon, the symbol of the terrible mother, and enters into the womb to face her true form, an egg-like shape with ghostly arms reaching out, promising safety in the sweet embrace of death. At the core of the egg is the glowing light of creation, yet it uses a single attack simply named Death. Like the World Arcana, it is both the beginning and the end, life and death. It represents the unlimited potential of the human unconscious in all its faculties, its destruction as well as its rebirth. Thanks to the strength of his bonds, the hero unlocks his final ability, Great Seal, which can seal away Nyx and bring about a new beginning. Thus, the journey of the Fool comes to an end. The hero has found freedom through rebirth and become an enlightened figure, similar to Jung's wise old man archetype.
He's found the answer to life's greatest question. It just happened a bit sooner than it will for the rest of you.
A quaternity appears on the Tower of Tartarus resembling a cross, and it vanishes along with the Dark Hour, never to manifest ever again. Unified man has triumphed over the dark half of the human totality. This is humanity's final answer to Nyx. Death is something we must all face one day, and by facing it in this game, the developers wanted all of us to take away something different. They do not have all of the answers, nor do they pretend to. At the end of the day, it's up to us to take the experience of Persona 3 and think about it for ourselves. But we're not done just yet. I hope to see you all next time in part 2 of this analysis, where we'll take a look at the characters, social links and gameplay. If you want to support the channel, there's links in the description. Until next time, farewell.
立ち向かう勇気君にもらっただ